So we want to move to discussing the white racial frame reading, I want to let you all know like that this edition is the latest edition of this textbook. It just came out in August. It's one of the books that really help us and has continued to help us refine how we define racism through the lens of ideology, and it's played a really important role for that. Essentially, what we want you all to, or I guess the key aspects of our racial frame that we think are important to name before we get deep into the text, is that it really is a comprehensive orienting structure, right? That white people, but also people of color, have used to understand, interpret, and act in social settings. So it's the way in which we talk about like that kind of common sense way of being in the world that lends itself to thinking about race and structure, that kind of common sense. And so in this way, it enables and contributes to white denial about the reality of race and racism, because it's set up in a way where you don't have to see it, right? If you frame things through the lens of whiteness, what you see are these instances, you see these individual acts and individual instances. You don't take the time to see the interconnectedness and the lens through which how it's been connected through history, right? Because too few people realize that for most of US history, you're talking about over 80% of the history of the United States, we have been a country grounded in and shaped by racial terror, right? So you're talking about genocide, enslavement, the mistreatment of all manner of BIPOC folks, not just Black folks, right? We're talking about just anybody that's not white. And then even within the framework where we understand whiteness, there are certain groups who were not allowed to be white in the beginning and had to kind of move towards earning whiteness, if you will. And so when we settle in that and we recognize that this is the history of our country, right? For those of us who are in America, we see that, again, most of our history, we have been grounded in and shaped by racial terror. And that really influences how we go about and how we think in terms of normalizing the racism that we see today. So what is the white racial frame? The white racial frame is the dominant worldview held by many people, especially white people. Again, it helps us conceptualize what we mean by stereotypes, prejudices, ideologies, image, emotions, and reactions, as well as the way we racialize language accents and our inclination to discriminate, right? Not just discrimination, but the way in which we are inclined to discriminate. What I thought was profound in the text is the Gallup poll that basically said that 77% of, and again, this Gallup poll came out in 2019, so it's before everything that's happened this year, and I wonder what the numbers will be now. But 77% of Black people said they suffer from discrimination from the local police, and only 45% of whites believed that was true, right? 45% believe whites believe that was true. And that trend continues in a number of areas: shopping, discrimination, workplace discrimination, dealing with hospitals and doctors. And so essentially what this points out is that so many white Americans are unaware of the extent to which racial discrimination impacts BIPOC folks and often exhibit a collective denial of the BIPOC experience. And this again is due to the white racial frame. What it does, it contributes to the ideological aspects of structural racism, wherein it allows whiteness or the white frame to be seen as truth, the truth of the way things are. And the only way you can begin to dismantle this notion of truth is there have to be enough evidence that begins to undermine it. The problem with that is often the evidence, as Seth said, isn't just through data, because there's enough data that you can find that proves discrimination. It's a combination of both data and relationships. And when you consider the fact that roughly over 90% of white people do not have any relationships with people who are not white, you see how challenging it is, right? To upset this kind of white racial frame. And by relationships, I mean not just as somebody you know at work that's a person of color that you talk to. I'm talking about like actual authentic relationships, right? That someone you would really have a conversation with, the people you, as Seth would say, that you can cry with. And so in this sense, we recognize the challenge ahead of us is really to help people understand how and particularly why this frame works this way and how it's been used to maintain this structure of white supremacy. And again, that comes across through the lens of ideology. And so this is our definition of race. I know we talked about it last week, so I just want to mention it again. We're really focusing on, and this white racial frame really helps us to understand numbers 3, the institutionalized racial ideologies, with ideology being a set of racialized stereotypes, ideas, beliefs, attitudes, emotions, and narratives, which help normalize and moralize racism. I want to be clear in terms of the last parts. Essentially, we have to remember that for, again, the majority of the history of our country, Christianity, right, has moralized racial discrimination, right? There have been clergy who participated not only in owning slaves, but participated in white nationalist groups up through and past the civil rights movement. We see clergy participating in that kind of racialized dog whistle politics right now, right? And so that's where we have to recognize the ways in which this becomes a moral discourse that's used through the lens of usually performative whiteness, as Seth said, the spiritual anthropology, how we understand ourselves to be human, often within a theological context, is rooted in the performance of whiteness, which we're really going to talk about with the next reading we're going to have. So how does this actually play out in action, right? So if you talk about political ways it works, you talk about immigration, you have DACA, right? In terms of how that's discriminatory. Ideologically, that's supported by this idea that these people are illegal, quote unquote, and they don't deserve the same rights, that they're taking our jobs, right? And how this impacts them economically is that it impacts their career earnings, right? It impacts their job prospects because people could be afraid to hire them. Employers are afraid to hire them because their citizenship status or the ability to be in the country is tenuous. If you talk about housing, right? You think about economically how this harms people. We have predatory lending. Not only did this happen with the history of redlining, but it still happened up through today, where Wells Fargo just had to pay a bunch of money because they were giving bad loans to people who have better credit because they're people of color, right? They were not giving them the best loan they actually qualify for. Within the last recession. And so what this does is it creates little to no generational wealth that can be developed because housing and property ownership is the primary way wealth is developed in our country, right? Politically, this limits BIPOC political power because in our country, economic power is directly tied to political power. And it also limits democratic representation because of the lack of physical mobility, right? Like people of color, BIPOC folks cannot move from place to place to actually one could argue have the option to move out of their own local communities. I want to say it's 70%, it's either 65 or 70% of African Americans still live in former slaveholding states, right? And so that's the part I talk about, literally limits democratic representation because of physical mobility. And those are the states that also have the most restrictive voter policies, right? That as the Voting Rights Act got gutted, we're seeing the consequence of that. Ideologically, what this comes up with housing is it promotes the idea that good neighborhoods are predominantly white because they have the same quote unquote values. And values is one of those loaded terms. We're basically saying whether they're like us. We talk about education. Economically, you look at the fact that majority of BIPOC schools are underfunded. This maintains a kind of working class that's able to do the kind of work that we need in a kind of capitalistic society. Politically, we know that the amount of education is directly linked to the amount of political activism, right? The more people understand how the system works, the more they're willing to engage the political system. And if they don't understand it, it fosters a kind of cynicism, like, well, whatever I do not really gonna change anything anyway. Ideologically, what it says is that schools with higher BIPOC folks are not quote unquote good schools. Again, this is a loaded word. For those of you who have children or had children in K through 12, you know, when people say what's a good school, ask yourself, what do you mean by good, right? And there's an amazing podcast that we're going to point you guys to in a few weeks that really helps us unpack what we're talking about. We're talking about public school or private school. What do we mean we're talking about good with regards to race and racism? Policing, right? So we talk about ideological. You have this idea that Black people are not intelligent. Now, again, this is a historical trend, because this actually isn't the way in which Black people were enslaved. It wasn't because they were intelligent. Actually, it was because they were smart. But this ideology changed to normalize racism. So now you get the idea that Black people are not intelligent, that they're emotional, that they're more prone to violence. But also, you get the ideology that police are victims, right? Because they have such a tough job because they have to protect us, quote unquote, from the not intelligent, emotional, and violent Black people. And so what it does politically is it creates a space of mass incarceration for Black folks, a loss of voting rights, because if you are charged with a felony, in many states you can no longer vote. And it also creates qualified immunity for police so they cannot be held accountable for their policing. And it creates a space in the arguments for stronger police unions. What this does economically is it has fostered a system of prison labor wage theft, right? For Seth and I, you know, we were in California. So many of the firefighters that are out literally fighting fires here are prisoners who are paid about $3 a day, right? $3 a day, or they're out working not only to protect my life, but they could die. And so that is insane. And this all comes from the notion when you watch 13th, if you haven't seen it, or actually a better documentary that kind of helped explain this will be Slavery by Another Name, which I know I mentioned last time. It talks about the notion of peonage and the ways in which you were able to be re-enslaved essentially if you committed a crime. And so that began the trajectory on in terms of mass incarceration. Again, this leads to higher unemployment for Black people, BIPOC folks in general, and an increase in police funding, where they get a disproportionate amount of city budgets, even though they do not serve the entire community the same. And we could say that the money could be better spent in other places.